Welcome to the Finding Your Church podcast from findingyourchurch.com. My name is Jeremy Phillips, and my goal is to help you make it a challenge for people to live in your community without finding your church. Now, on this episode, I want to talk about podcasting for your church, and hopefully if you follow the steps, you should be able to create your own church podcast using this information. Now, I say, should and hopefully because you just never know what can happen. There can be issues that are out of your or my control. You may miss a step or whatever, but if you follow the steps, you should be able to create your own church podcast and get on iTunes with this information. Now, this is going to be a little longer podcast than normal too, because there's just a lot of information to cover. So the first thing you think of when looking at church podcasting are the sermons from the main Sunday morning service. But there are a lot of places in churches that could benefit from podcasting within the church. You could podcast individual ministry services. You could create a podcast for your volunteers to keep them informed and engaged in what's going on at the church. You could create a discipleship podcast separate from your Sunday morning service for everyone in your church for increased spiritual growth. You know your church and where a podcast would potentially fit. It does take some work, so you don't want to go to the effort if you think nobody will connect with it. But there are some benefits if you can create a podcast that people connect to. The main benefit is that people can subscribe and have the content you put in the podcast feed come directly to their computer or mobile device. That's huge. For sure, in the case of iTunes, it's very clear when that person has new content that is ready to be watched or listened to. But how do you create a podcast for your church? The ideas that you can come up with for the content of the podcast are up to you, but the steps to creating a podcast are pretty much the same for everyone. Now, there are many, many ways to create a podcast that can be submitted to iTunes. And the way that I am going to walk you through here is not the only way, but it is a way and it works. And it is one of the best ways to create a podcast that fits into your existing church website. There are external websites like podbean.com that can do this, but even that costs money. So in my opinion, you might as well do it correctly from the start and make it either directly connected or loosely connected to your website. I'll explain the difference between directly and loosely connected in just a second. So with this method of creating a church podcast, you will need to create a WordPress website. If you already have a WordPress website for your church that has been working for you and it has a working blog, you are pretty much already set up to be able to start your podcast. And a lot of churches already use WordPress, so that's fine. There are a few things that you're going to need to do, however, to make this work so that it is subscribable in iTunes and the other podcast feed players. But you will need a WordPress website. So that is where the difference between a podcast that is directly connected and one that is loosely connected to your site come into play. If your main church website is created with WordPress and has a blog feature enabled, then you can directly connect the podcast into the blog feed of your site. If your main website is not WordPress, then you can either change and create a WordPress website, or you can create a separate WordPress installation to run your podcast on. You can set this up on your existing church website hosting account if you already have access to that, but many churches are set up with website developers and companies that do not give you access to your website hosting account. So the other option is to purchase another website hosting account just for your podcast. You can find the website hosting that I recommend at findingyourchurch.com/toolbox in the most recommended resources section. Now, this is a company that is connected to findingyourchurch.com, and I will receive a small commission if you purchase using my page link, but it does not cost you any more to use my link. It just helps me out a little bit. So there are other products like that on the page as well that are connected to us, but this website hosting company is what I run my sites on, and I recommend it. So whether you are creating an entire church website or just creating a WordPress installation for the podcast, you will get a free website domain name for the first year when you use my recommended hosting at findingyourchurch.com/toolbox, and it's called Bluehost. So my recommendation, if you are creating a podcast only site, is to get a domain name that just adds the word podcast to your church website name. So that way the link is very similar to your church name, something like mychurchnamepodcast.com. So that's your first step. If you are not set up for WordPress already or do not have access to your website hosting, get website hosting from findingyourchurch.com/toolbox and create your account right now. So once you either have access to or have purchased the website hosting and log into your account, you will want to go to the cPanel section of your hosting account, at least on the hosting that I recommend. And this is basically your dashboard, and remember that it may look different on your website hosting account. So then you go to what is probably labeled the website builder section or something similar, and find the install WordPress button. Now remember, if you're not using my hosting recommendation, there may not be a one-step install button, but most hosts do have that. And it's not exactly one step, but it just makes it really simple for you to do instead of having to do it manually. So this is going to walk you through the process of installing WordPress. You will most likely get an email letting you know your username, password, and link to log into your new WordPress website. Now, what we are going to talk about is how to set up the podcast. We're not going to talk about how to design your site or use themes for WordPress. And the reason is because even if you create a new WordPress website for the podcast and have the basic design that it comes with, it will still work. You do not have to put a bunch of effort into this unless you are going to send people to this actual site to listen to the podcast. But we're setting up in iTunes. And so you can still design that later. But for right now, we're just trying to make it work. So you can always go back and make tweaks and changes to it later. So what you're going to do is log into your new WordPress account dashboard and go to the plugins section. And that's most likely located on the sidebar in the left hand section. So click on Add New in the plugin section, then search for Blueberry PowerPress plugin, and it's spelled kind of funny. It's Blubrry. So make sure that you type it in correctly or just search for PowerPress, and then click to install that plugin. Now, after it is installed, you will find the settings for the plugin in the sidebar in the same areas the plugins section was located, and it's going to be most likely under the word PowerPress. So there are a lot of settings that we could go through, but the main tabs that you need to worry about are the iTunes and Artwork tabs. And so under iTunes, you will fill in the information about your podcast. And this is going to take a little bit of thought, but you can always come back and do this later. But I would suggest at least putting some thought into this because you want your podcast to be approved by iTunes. So your title is actually the title of your blog or website. And you can change this in the settings of your WordPress dashboard by going to Settings in the sidebar and then clicking General and change that title. So you will enter in all of those details for your iTunes podcast, then go to the Artwork tab and upload your podcast artwork. And there are instructions on that page for your artwork. So if you know how to do that, great. If you don't know how to create this, then you can download my free Fiverr for Churches PDF guide at findingyourchurch.com/toolbox and learn how to have someone create this for you on Fiverr for as little as $5. Or you can use Photoshop or a free software like Canva.com to create this artwork. So once this is complete, you're going to need to place an audio file linked in a blog post so that iTunes has something to connect with when you submit your podcast. So one lesson that I learned the hard way is that you do not want to host your podcast audio files on the same hosting as your website. I actually had a website taken down briefly for doing just that because they said it was sucking up too much resources. So what you want to do is create an account. This is the one I would recommend because it works. You know, a lot of people have tried to use Dropbox and Google Drive and stuff to host their files for free, and it may work, but it's just more challenging. So you can get an Amazon S3 file hosting account, and this is extremely cheap and literally hardly costs anything. I've received a monthly bill for under $1 before, so there's not like some major expense that will go along with this. So you'll go to amazon.com/S3 or just do a Google search for it and create your account. And you can probably use the account already connected to your church Amazon account or even personal, but I would keep it within the church. So inside your account, you will create what are called buckets. And this simply differentiates your uploads for you. So you could actually create a separate bucket for podcast episodes and then one for images or something like that if you wanted to, host multiple types of files. So create a new podcast bucket. And then when you get inside that bucket, you will click to upload a file. Upload your audio file. And it definitely helps to already have a podcast episode created, but you don't have to do that. You can really use any audio file. I would just make sure that it's not copyrighted and that it's not something that's just really short and ridiculous because you want iTunes to go ahead and approve it. So, if you have a sermon or it can be an old sermon or whatever. So once that file is uploaded, right click on the file link and select to make public, and that'll take just a second, and this allows people outside of your account to access and listen to the file. And so then you go to the properties section that's probably on the right, and you will find the MP3 audio link. And so you'll copy that file and then go back to WordPress in your dashboard and create a new post. And I've got some tutorials that I've linked in the show notes that are going to show you how to use WordPress and how to use the dashboard. So don't worry about that. You can go through that simple video training there for free WordPress tutorials. And so scroll down to the podcast episode section. When you're creating this new post, you go all the way out, probably almost to the bottom of the post editor, and paste the audio link into the media URL area, and then click verify just to make sure the link actually works. So then you scroll back up and click publish to create your first post, and then you'll click on view post, and you should be able to see the post and play your audio file. Now you want to go back to the WordPress Podcast plugin settings and go back to the iTunes section, and under the item subscription URL section you will find the recommended feed to submit to iTunes. So you're going to copy that link and then either click to publish an account on iTunes, that's right there in the settings there, or just open your iTunes account in the iTunes app on your computer, and go to the iTunes store and click to submit a podcast. And of course you're going to need an iTunes account, and hopefully it is a church iTunes account and not a personal one to complete this step. So when you get to the submit a podcast page on iTunes, simply paste in that feed link and follow the steps to get started with your iTunes podcast. So you're just taking the link that was in the iTunes settings in the WordPress plugin and pasting it in the submit a podcast page on iTunes. So it will most likely take a couple of days at least for them to review and either approve or deny your podcast. So in the meantime, you can be working on your website design or creating more podcast episodes. So to wrap up, all of the resources that you need, including your website hosting link, the Fiverr for Churches free book link, and I've even added some free WordPress video tutorials, a link to some of those that are going to help you get more familiar with the WordPress dashboard in case you're not. You can find all of that information and links at findingyourchurch.com/toolbox. So that is one way to create a WordPress-based church podcast. Now get started and go and get found.